She was my landlady, twice my age, but when she whispered she didn't want my rent, she wanted me, my world shifted forever. Part 1, The First Glance, expanded. I still remember the first time I saw her. It was late afternoon, the kind of hour where the sun hangs low and paints everything in a golden haze. I had just hauled my last box up the narrow staircase, sweat clinging to my back, when the door at the end of the hallway opened. And there she was, my landlady. She wasn't what I expected. Most people imagine landlords as cold or distant, but she carried herself with a quiet grace, like someone who had already seen much of life and learned how to stand steady through it. She was 42, though if you only looked at her smile, you might have guessed younger. Her dark hair fell neatly to her shoulders, catching the light in soft streaks, and her eyes, calm, knowing, rested on me in a way that made my hands tighten awkwardly around the box I was holding. "Welcome," she said, her voice warm, low, almost like the sound of a favorite song you hadn't heard in years. She gestured toward the apartment door behind her. "Come in, let me show you the place." I followed her inside, and the moment I stepped across the threshold, I felt something different. The space didn't feel like a rental, it felt like a home that had been lived in and cared for. Lace curtains let in shafts of fading sunlight that danced across wooden floors. A vase of fresh lilies sat on the dining table, their fragrance soft in the air. There was a faint hint of vanilla, like she had been baking earlier, and it made the room feel impossibly warm for a stranger's house. She walked slowly, deliberately, her movements calm, unhurried, as though she was inviting me into more than just the apartment. I noticed the way she touched the furniture, lightly, as if every corner of the room held a memory. She pointed out the details, the kitchen window that opened to the garden, the reading nook by the bay window. Her words were practical, but her presence was not. When she handed me the keys, her fingers brushed against mine. It wasn't much, just a fleeting touch, but it left me strangely aware of her warmth, of the steadiness in her hand compared to the restless pulse in my own. I glanced at her, half expecting her to notice the way I froze for that brief second, but she only smiled. Not a landlord's smile. Something gentler. In that moment, I realized two things. First, she was beautiful, not in a loud, obvious way, but in a way that lingered with you after you looked away. And second, there was a quietness about her, the kind that didn't demand attention but drew it all the same. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just tired from moving, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But as the door closed behind her and I stood alone in the silence of my new apartment, I could still feel the ghost of her touch in my palm, like a spark I wasn't ready to admit had already been lit. Part 2, Domestic Warmth, expanded. The first week in the apartment passed quietly, but it didn't take long for me to notice something unusual about her. Most landlords check in only when something breaks, but she seemed to find reasons to appear, always with a softness that didn't feel intrusive. Sometimes it was just a knock on the door in the evening. "I made too much tea," she'd say, holding 2 cups in her hands, steam curling upward into the hallway. Other times, she'd ask about my work, or if I was settling in all right, as though the walls of the apartment mattered less than the person inside it. Her presence had a way of filling the room, even when she wasn't saying much. She would set a cup of tea in front of me and sit across the table, her posture straight but relaxed, her eyes lingering just a moment too long before slipping away. I noticed the small details then, the faint scent of her perfume, the way her fingers curled around the mug, her nails neatly kept, painted in a muted shade that somehow matched her quiet elegance. The kitchen always carried her touch. Fresh flowers sat in a glass vase by the window, and every time I passed through, there was a gentle scent of vanilla or cinnamon clinging to the air, as if she had been baking just hours before. It wasn't the smell of a house, it was the smell of a home, lived in and cared for. And slowly, I began to feel part of it. One evening stands out in particular. I was sitting at the small kitchen table, books and notes scattered in front of me, when she appeared with her usual calm. She set down 2 cups of chamomile tea and took the chair across from mine. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the warm yellow lamp above us. Outside, the city had gone quiet, the muffled hum of distant cars blending with the steady ticking of a wall clock. She asked me about my day. I answered, but my words felt clumsy under the weight of her gaze. Her eyes were steady, focused, as though she was trying to read more than what I said. There was no rush in the way she listened, she gave me her full attention, and it unsettled me in ways I couldn't explain. At one point, I looked up from my notes and caught her watching me. For a heartbeat too long, she didn't look away. Something flickered across her face, hesitation, longing, maybe both. Then, just as quickly, she lowered her eyes to her tea, her lips curving into a smile so soft I wondered if I'd imagined the moment entirely. And yet, that night when I lay in bed, I could still see it, the unspoken thing in her eyes, lingering like the taste of chamomile on my tongue. Part 3, The Whispered Confession, expanded. It was a rainy night, the kind where the world outside feels swallowed in darkness, with only the steady tapping of drops against the windows breaking the silence. I had been in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, crouched under the sink with a wrench in my hand. The faucet had been leaking for days, and though it wasn't my responsibility, I hated the sound of water dripping into the basin all night. I didn't hear her come in at first. It was only when her voice, low and curious, drifted across the room that I realized I wasn't alone. "You're fixing that yourself?" I turned, and there she stood in the doorway, framed by the soft glow of the hallway light. She had her arms crossed loosely, not in judgment but in quiet surprise. She was dressed simply, an oversized cardigan, hair falling loose around her shoulders, but even then, she carried that same graceful composure that always seemed to disarm me. "Couldn't sleep," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "Figured I'd try to stop the dripping." She stepped closer, the floor creaking under her bare feet. There was something intimate about her being there at that hour, when the rest of the world was asleep. She crouched beside me, close enough that I could catch the faint scent of her perfume, something subtle, floral, not overpowering but unforgettable. "You didn't have to," she murmured. Her hand rested lightly on my forearm, just for balance as she leaned forward to look at the pipe, but the warmth of her skin against mine sent a current through me I wasn't prepared for. I froze, wrench still in my hand, pulse suddenly louder than the rain. She didn't move her hand right away. Instead, she lingered there, her eyes searching mine with a softness that felt almost dangerous. And then, in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, she said it. "I don't want your rent. I want you." The words hung in the air, fragile and heavy at the same time, like glass balanced on the edge of a table. For a second, I thought I had misheard her, that the rain or my own thoughts had twisted her meaning. But the way she looked at me, eyes steady, lips parted just slightly, told me she meant every word. My breath caught. I wanted to speak, to answer, but nothing came. All I could do was sit there, the weight of her confession pressing against me, making the small kitchen feel suddenly too narrow, too close. She pulled her hand back then, slowly, almost reluctantly, and the space between us filled with a silence that wasn't empty, it was charged, alive. I knew, in that moment, that everything between us had shifted. The next morning, the rain was gone, but its memory clung to the air, damp, heavy, filled with the smell of wet earth drifting in through the open window. The apartment was quieter than usual. Too quiet. I moved through the kitchen, making coffee just to give my hands something to do. Every sound, the clink of the spoon, the hiss of the kettle, seemed louder than it should have been. My thoughts kept circling back to the night before, to her words whispered in that fragile space between us. "I don't want your rent. I want you." I repeated it in my head, testing the weight of it, trying to decide whether it had been a mistake, or a truth that had been waiting to escape for years. When she appeared that morning, standing at the end of the hallway, it was as if the air thickened around us. She wore a pale blouse tucked into jeans, her hair loosely tied back. Ordinary, casual, but to me, nothing about her felt ordinary anymore. "Morning," she said, her voice quieter than usual, as if she, too, was carrying the heaviness of last night. "Morning," I replied, my tone steady but my chest unsteady. She lingered there, her hand brushing the frame of the door as though she wasn't sure whether to step forward or retreat. Her eyes flickered to me, then down to the floor, then back again, each glance holding something she wouldn't put into words. I wanted to ask her what she meant. I wanted to know if she regretted saying it, if she wished she could take it back. But something inside me hesitated. Maybe it was fear of the answer. Maybe it was the age difference. What would people say, what would they assume? She was 42, composed, experienced. I was 24, still figuring out where my life was heading. And yet, when her eyes finally held mine for longer than a heartbeat, I saw the vulnerability behind her composure. A quiet plea. A hope she didn't dare voice again. The sunlight stretched across the wooden floor between us, long and golden, as though marking the distance we hadn't yet closed. She cleared her throat softly, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and said something simple, something safe. "Did you sleep well?" I nodded. "Yeah. You?" She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. The moment slipped away, carried off by the smallness of our words. But the silence that followed told a different story. We were both standing on the edge of something. Neither of us ready to step forward, neither willing to step back. The days that followed carried an unspoken weight. Our exchanges became polite, almost too polite, as if we were both pretending nothing had been said that rainy night. And yet, the silence between us wasn't empty, it pulsed with something unsaid, something neither of us could ignore. It was an evening just after sunset when the distance finally began to break. The sky outside glowed with streaks of fading orange and deepening blue, the kind of twilight that made everything feel suspended between night and day. I stepped out onto the porch, hoping the cool air would quiet the storm in my chest. She was already there. Sitting on the wooden steps, her posture was straighter than usual, as though she was holding herself together by sheer will. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, fingers entwined so firmly I wondered if they hurt. For a moment, she didn't notice me. She was staring into the distance, her lips pressed in a line, her eyes glistening in the dim light. When she finally turned, I caught a glimpse of something raw, loneliness she had worked so hard to conceal. I sat down beside her, leaving a careful space between us. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the garden below. Neither of us spoke at first. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable, it was the silence of two people standing at the edge of honesty, afraid to step over. Then her voice came, low and uneven. I don't usually let people in," she confessed, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "After the divorce, I told myself I'd be fine. That I didn't need anyone." She exhaled shakily, her hands tightening. "But some nights, it feels unbearably quiet." Her words struck something in me. They weren't rehearsed, they spilled out like water breaking past a dam. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached across the space between us, gently covering her clasped hands with my own. My touch was light at first, uncertain, but when she didn't pull away, I pressed just a little firmer. Her skin was cool against mine, and I could feel the faint tremor in her fingers. She turned then, meeting my eyes with a look that made my chest ache, a mixture of relief, fear, and a fragile kind of hope. We didn't need many words after that. The silence between us shifted, no longer heavy but tender, as though our joined hands were saying everything we couldn't. That night, I realized we weren't just landlord and tenant anymore. We were two people carrying different scars, both quietly longing for something neither of us had dared to name, until now. That night, the air inside the house felt different. It wasn't anything she said, or anything I did, it was simply the way we moved around each other, as though both of us finally understood we couldn't keep pretending. The living room was softly lit by a single lamp, its glow spilling across the old rug, the shelves lined with books, the steady tick of the clock filling the silence. I stood near the window, restless, my hands shoved into my pockets, while she lingered by the table, running her fingers absent-mindedly along the rim of her teacup. There was hesitation in the air, like we were standing on the edge of something fragile. I could feel her glancing at me, and when I finally looked back, our eyes met and held. It was just a moment, but it carried everything. She moved first. Slowly, carefully, as though she didn't want to startle either of us. She crossed the room, her steps measured, her breathing unsteady. When she stopped in front of me, the distance between us was barely a breath. Her eyes searched mine, questioning, uncertain. For once, she didn't wear her calm composure. Instead, there was vulnerability, like she was silently asking if it was safe to let herself fall. I didn't speak. Words felt unnecessary. Instead, I lifted my hand, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. My fingers lingered against her cheek longer than they should have, and she closed her eyes at the touch, a soft exhale escaping her lips. And then, almost without realizing it, she stepped into me. Her arms slipped around my shoulders, tentative at first, then firmer as if she couldn't hold back anymore. Instinctively, I wrapped my arms around her waist, pulling her closer until I could feel the steady rise and fall of her breathing against my chest. She rested her head against me, her cheek pressed to the fabric of my shirt. For a long time, neither of us moved. There was no urgency, no rush, just the quiet, trembling relief of two people who had finally stopped fighting what they felt. Her heartbeat was steady, grounding, while mine raced against it. I breathed her in, the faint floral perfume, the warmth of her hair brushing my chin, and in that embrace, the world outside didn't matter. Not the whispers of judgment, not the difference in years. Just her. Just us. When she finally drew back, it was only far enough to look at me. Her eyes glistened, her lips parted as though she wanted to say something, but she didn't. She didn't have to. Because in that embrace, we had already said it all. The morning after felt different. Not in the way of some dramatic transformation, but in the quiet, steady way a room feels once the storm has passed. I woke early, drawn by the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen. The smell of coffee drifted through the air, warm and rich, mixed with the faint sweetness of butter sizzling in a pan. For a moment, I simply stood in the doorway, watching her. She moved about with an ease I hadn't seen before, her hair loosely tied, the sleeves of her blouse rolled up as she flipped something in the pan. There was no careful composure now, just a woman at home, humming faintly under her breath, unaware that anyone was watching. I stepped inside, and she turned, surprised, a smile softening her face. "You're up early," she said, sliding a plate onto the counter. "Couldn't sleep," I admitted. "Or maybe I just didn't want to." She laughed lightly, but there was something guarded in her eyes, as though she wasn't sure what came next. The memory of last night, the embrace, the way she melted against me, still lingered between us, but it needed words now. I moved closer, taking the plate gently from her hands and setting it aside. My voice was low, steady. "I don't want to just be your tenant." Her breath caught. She froze, her fingers brushing the counter, eyes lifting to mine. "I want to be here," I continued. "With you. Not because I have nowhere else to go. Not because of convenience. Because when I'm with you, everything feels right." For a long moment, she just looked at me. Her lips trembled slightly, her eyes glistening as though she was holding back tears she hadn't let anyone see in years. And then, slowly, she reached out, her fingers slipping into mine. "You have no idea," she whispered, her voice breaking into a soft laugh, "how long I've waited to hear that." The relief in her smile was unlike anything I'd seen before, quiet, genuine, almost disbelieving. She squeezed my hand, and in that simple gesture, I felt the weight of her walls crumbling, her trust being placed in me. We sat together at the table, fingers still intertwined, the morning sun spilling across us in a golden wash. Outside, the world carried on, cars passing, birds calling, but in that kitchen, it felt like time had stilled. For the first time, there were no hesitations, no pretenses. Just two people who had finally chosen each other.